A range of plants enjoy connections with Christmas, not least due to their status as evergreens, and at a time when many plants have shed their leaves, these plants offer a welcome burst of colour. Ivy, or Hedera helix, is no exception, and even features in Christmas carols such as The Holly and the Ivy. Now, it has somewhat fallen out of favour, not least because of its invasive nature and ability to weaken built structures. That said, its berries provide a food source to birds in the winter, while its leaves shelter various species in inclement weather. But what is the folklore of ivy? Why is it linked with Christmas? And how is it used in magic? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We're finally into December, and we are therefore looking at Christmas-related plants. And I thought I would start off with ivy, because I do actually have episodes on holly and mistletoe, both of which you can find linked below. And indeed, if you are listening to this through the podcast.co browser-based version, there is actually a search box on there now, which is a really welcome addition to this particular platform, where you can always search for keywords and it'll then show you if I do have a podcast episode on that particular topic, which is generally how I remind myself of what some of my past episodes are, because we are past 200 now, so it's quite easy for me to forget what I've actually done. But anyway, like I said, we are doing ivy this week. And I do actually quite like ivy as a plant. I know it does have its issues, and compared to other types of plants that I do on the podcast, I do think it's one of the relatively benign ones. Now, I'm not going to cover poison ivy because that's obviously completely the wrong plant. So we are looking at like ivy as in Hedera helix, like I said in the introduction. So we might as well just jump in because, why do we need a preamble? So I thought it would be a good place to start with the link between ivy and alcohol, because ivy has long enjoyed a link with alcohol, and while this might at first seem like a bit of a strange combination, in antiquity the plant was actually linked with both the Roman Bacchus and the Greek Dionysus. Their followers wore wreaths of ivy, and drinking establishments that offered wine would hang an ivy vine from a pole outside, obviously to advertise their wares. And ivy even appears in remedies designed to ward off the hangovers and illness caused by alcohol. First, you were directed to dissolve ivy berries in vinegar, and you were then supposed to drink that solution. Next, you would then take ivy leaves, you would bruise them, boil them in water, and then drink that solution. Now, I can't stress enough how much you should not do this. Like, that was an old remedy that people used to rely on. Nowadays, we have such things as Alka-Seltzer and so on. I mean, I don't drink, so I'm assuming that works for hangovers and so on. And I mean, a lot of people also swear by things like bacon sandwiches. So if that is something that is in your remit, then enjoy. But please don't be drinking things that you've boiled ivy in, because that's just not a good idea. But I just thought it was really interesting that people thought that because it advertised alcohol, it might somehow therefore also prove to be the cure. Other people, and this is a bit more doable, actually believe that wearing an ivy wreath on your head would ward off drunkenness. And that's something that I think we should bring back, because I would quite like to see people walking around wearing ivy wreaths. And if you laid a trail of ivy leaves across a drunkard's path, it was supposed to sober him up. So that's quite an interesting one. Now, there were also other remedies that involved ivy as well, and people would actually make their children drink from ivy wood bowls when they had whooping cough. And meanwhile, soaking ivy leaves in vinegar would turn them into a useful poultice to help treat corns, and that was quite a popular option in Oxfordshire. And I thought that was a really interesting one to come across, because over on plantlore.com, which is an absolutely fabulous site if you haven't looked at it, one respondent actually noted successfully tying ivy onto a corn and then being able to dig the corn out after removing the leaf. So it does seem like that particular poultice option with ivy leaves and vinegar may actually work. And obviously ivy's really plentiful as well, so you don't really have to worry about where you're going to get it from. But another respondent remembered their mother making an ivy poultice for a suppurating wound, which apparently worked. And other respondents noted that boiling ivy and keeping the juice actually made a wonderful cleanser for serge fabric. So I quite like the fact that that's not a remedy for a person, but it just brings up your fabric lovely. So might be worth bearing that one in mind. Now, another thing that I do find quite a lot when I put these episodes together is the number of things that have divination involved with them. And you know me, you know I love a good spot of divination. I mean, I read tarot cards, I'm currently learning how to read playing cards. So I do quite like seeing these old things that people used to do to try and predict the future using just the stuff that was around them. And ivy leaves was a really accessible way of doing this. And there was a Halloween divination in Herefordshire. I dare say it was probably used in other parts of the country as well, but this is indeed what the folklore said. And family members would write their name or mark their name in some way on an ivy leaf before dropping it into a bowl of water on Halloween. The following morning, the family would then inspect the leaves, and if anyone's name had turned into a coffin shape, death was coming for them, and soon. The same practice appears in Cornwall on Twelfth Night and on New Year's Eve in Hampshire, and I think you do find a lot of these prediction-based practices at certain times of the year. You also find them around Midsummer's Eve as well. And the content is nearly always the same, even if the time that they're done and indeed the place in which they're done differs. So this is one of the things that I always find I want people to take away from these episodes, that there are variations on folklore, and just because a version happens one way in one place doesn't negate the fact that it appears at a completely different time of year somewhere else. It's just a variation on the practice. But there are other things you can do with ivy leaves, and apparently in Oxfordshire, girls would load their pockets with ivy leaves before going for a walk, and whichever young man they met first would be their future husband. And obviously that's a really accessible one that anybody could have a go at. But meanwhile, if you put an ivy leaf in water on New Year's Eve, you are actually directed to leave it until 12th night. Now, obviously, there is some consternation as to whether that means January the 5th or 6th, but there is the separate episode on 12th night folklore if you are interested. But a green leaf meant the coming year would be happy, and if you went back on 12th night and found that you had a black leaf, then that meant that illness would blight the year. If, worst case scenario, the leaf had actually decayed, it meant that you would die. And there is a link between ivy and death anyway, and you do see it a lot in graveyards. It's one of those plants that just appears pretty much all over the place because it does grow quite prolifically. And in the legend of Tristan and Isolde, the lovers were actually buried separately, but then an ivy vine apparently grew to connect their graves, and if anyone cut the vine, it simply regrew to renew their connection. And this could indeed perhaps explain the superstition that ivy grew best on the graves of those who died of lovesickness. Now, like I say, you do see ivy quite a lot in graveyards, but please don't pick the leaves from there, because that's considered bad luck. And picking an ivy leaf that grew on a church was actually supposed to cause sickness. So if you do want to gather ivy leaves so you can do the divinations, please just don't take them from consecrated ground, because that's where you get a lot of the bad luck associations. Whereas if it's just in your garden, you should be fine. Now, in the Victorian language of flowers, ivy actually represented fidelity in marriage. Yet if you sent someone a sprig of ivy complete with tendrils, it meant that you were assiduous to please. And I just feel like we should really bring back the Victorian language of flowers, shouldn't we? And I always say to people, like, if anybody wants to send me anything amusing online, then do feel free to send me a photo of a plant, and I will look it up in my favourite plant dictionary, which is the one from 1867 by Mrs. Burke, and I will look it up and see what the message is, because I just think that it's such an interesting concept. But anyway, I promised you ivy at Christmas. And this is a funny one where it wasn't immediately obvious why specifically ivy was used. Like, it wasn't for any inherent nature of the plant, other than the fact that it's an evergreen and it's obviously really plentiful and people could bring it in. Now, according to Christina Oakley Harrington, people should only bring ivy into the house for Christmas and never at other times of the year. And indeed, to go even further, you could only bring it into the house on Christmas Eve, not before. Now, carols praising holly and ivy actually date back to before the 15th century, and the carol The Holly and the Ivy is considered a medieval carol. Now, holly, being prickly and supposedly dominant, and I'm saying that in the biggest air quotes possible, was supposed to represent the masculine principle, while ivy was clingy and pliable, making it feminine. Of course, that is indeed where these meanings for the carol comes from, so obviously it's not applying modern sensibilities, it's the sensibilities from the 15th century. But interestingly, a custom from the Midlands actually claimed that the plant brought into the house first, i.e. holly or ivy, would dictate who would rule the household that year. So if holly was brought in first, it would mean the man, and ivy would mean the woman. Now, you may have noticed, a little bit of a problem with that one, because if you could only bring ivy in on Christmas Eve and not before, then there's a good chance you would have brought holly in earlier anyway. So that one doesn't really feel very fair. But there we go. Because in the 17th century, people did like to bring holly into the house as a symbol of fertility and fortune, but if holly berries were scarce, then people would actually substitute them for ivy sprigs instead. Now, until the end of the 19th century, people would keep holly and ivy until Candlemas, when it was burned, rather than being thrown away, although again this varies according to the part of the country. Because in some places the evergreens were burnt on Twelfth Night or Old Twelfth Night, which is the 17th of January, because those evergreens not burnt, and I quote, would turn into pixies and plague the house in the coming year, end quote. But it wasn't just at Christmas that you had to be careful what you did with ivy, because as we find with other plants, it could be both helpful and a hindrance to your household. So if you accidentally brought it into the house with firewood in Cambridgeshire, it meant bad luck for the household. So you did have to be very careful when you were collecting firewood near Christmas that you didn't bring it in too early. Now, believe it or not, ivy is actually believed to attract good fortune, and young women in Russia would pluck ivy sprigs, still wet with May dew, to bring themselves good luck. Now, they couldn't actually cut the sprigs because touching the plant with steel would negate the good luck, so they did have to pick them. If ivy grows on your house, it's said to protect those inside from harm, and it can also be used magically to let you see whoever wishes you harm as well. That said, if the ivy growing on your house withered, that foretold disaster. And in Wales in particular, that meant that the house would eventually pass to someone else. If you make an ivy wreath and wear it on May Day, you'll be able to tell good people from bad and apparently see witches as well. Although I'm not quite sure how that one works if everyone's wearing them to ward off drunkenness. And Christina Oakley Harrington also notes that if you need to represent a woman in a spell, you can use ivy, and as you've probably guessed, you could use holly to represent a man. And indeed, such was the link between ivy and women that in some counties, people would actually dress the last harvest sheaf in lace and ribbons and then bind it with ivy to create the so-called ivy girl. And they would carry her home to represent prosperity and bountiful yields for the farm. So I do quite like the fact that even though ivy's mostly associated with Christmas, it does also appear throughout the year for other reasons as well. And compared to some of the plants that I've covered here on Fabulous Folklore, like ivy is actually quite a benign one in a lot of ways, apart from the weird death divination things. But let's be honest, most of the divinations usually revolve around who are you going to marry and when are you going to die. So I think the plant is going to end up being associated with one of those two things. But I hope you enjoyed that whistle-stop tour of the folklore of ivy. There wasn't actually as much as I was anticipating compared to some of the plants covered on the podcast, but there we go. And like I say, there are also the two older episodes on holly and mistletoe if you're interested in those as well. Now, I was thinking, what other plant says Christmas? And I know obviously there's a big fad in the UK in particular to use poinsettias, but they're a relative newcomer to the UK. So I actually decided instead that we would have a look at the folklore of pine trees, because obviously that's what a lot of people traditionally use if they're going to have a real Christmas tree. I mean, mine's made out of plastic, but that's a side issue. And then for the final episode, just before Christmas, we're going to have a look at the Christmas rose, which isn't actually a rose at all, it's a hellebore. So I have managed to get a poisonous plant into the Christmas theme, which I was very proud of myself when I came up with that, because we all know how much I love poisonous plants. Now, we are only going to have 3 of these episodes this month because it is Christmas, and normally the other 2 would come out on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, and quite frankly, I don't know how many people are necessarily going to be listening on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve, and also, quite frankly, I actually need some time off because I haven't really taken any time off, like I say, all year. Even COVID didn't stop me, but I'm really starting to run on empty now. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make sure that there is other content to go up. So there is going to be an interview-based episode going up between Christmas and New Year, which is going to be perfect for those dark days where you've got no idea what day it is, what's happening or anything. And I'm also going to be part of a special multi-podcast episode as well, which will come out just before Christmas Eve. So at least you're still going to be getting plenty of content and so on, which will see you through into January when we'll go back to normal. But like I said, I do need to have a couple of weeks off because I'm just so tired. So I hope that you enjoyed all of that, and I hope that I see you next week when we'll have a look at the folklore of pine trees. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.